The camera fades in on the misty outline of Schönbrunn Palace. The echo of footsteps fills the marble halls, and for a moment, the grandeur of the Habsburg Empire feels alive again. But behind that splendor lies a silence, the silence of a woman history chose to forget. She was born a princess, married to an heir, and destined for a crown that never came. Her name was Stéphanie of Belgium, daughter of a king, wife to Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, and one of the most overlooked figures of 19th-century Europe. Most know her husband's story, the tragic crown prince who ended his life at Marling, leaving behind a cloud of scandal that stunned the world. But few ask what became of the woman left standing in the shadow of that catastrophe. Who was Stéphanie beyond the sorrowful widow seen in portraits? How did she navigate the treacherous politics of the imperial court, where every smile concealed a rivalry and every word could end a reputation? And why, even today, does her name remain buried beneath the glittering legends of the Habsburgs? Stéphanie's story is one of quiet defiance, intelligence, and survival. She lived in a world where women were expected to serve rather than shape destiny, yet she found subtle ways to assert her will. She endured the weight of blame, the cruelty of gossip, and the loneliness of exile. Still, she refused to disappear. Beneath her reserved demeanor was a strategic mind that learned to wield influence where it was least expected. In private circles, through carefully chosen alliances, and later, through her own words. To rediscover Stéphanie is to uncover a missing thread in Europe's royal tapestry. Her life reflects the contradictions of an empire nearing its end, magnificent yet decaying, powerful yet fragile. Through her eyes, we glimpse not only the grandeur of Vienna's palaces, but also the human cost of keeping that grandeur alive. She reminds us that history is not made solely by those who sit on thrones, but also by those who endure beneath them. In this documentary, we peel back the layers of silence surrounding the forgotten Archduchess. From her early years as the obedient Belgian princess to her complicated marriage with Rudolf, from the tragedy of Marling to her later years of isolation and dignity in Hungary, every chapter reveals a woman who refused to be defined by circumstance. Her story forces us to rethink what it meant to be royal, to be a woman, and to survive in a world built to silence both. Now let us step beyond the official portraits and dusty archives. Let us listen to the whispers history tried to erase, and meet Stéphanie, the vanishing princess who refused to vanish entirely. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we uncover Stéphanie's untold story, the imperial court's secret revealed, the untold journey of a woman trapped between empire and independence, and how her story reshapes everything we thought we knew about power, loyalty, and survival within the Habsburg world. Princess Stéphanie of Belgium is one of those figures who stand at the edge of European history, their lives once prominent, but later allowed to fade into the background of greater political narratives. Her story reflects not only the personal struggles of a royal woman caught between dynastic duty and private desire, but also the way history often chooses its subjects, celebrating some and overlooking others. Born into the grand world of 19th-century royalty, she lived through the twilight of imperial Europe, and her journey from the glitter of court life to the obscurity of her later years reveals much about how women of her rank were seen, valued, and remembered. Stéphanie was born in the mid-19th century as the daughter of King Leopold II of Belgium and Queen Marie Henriette. Her father would become known to history not for his domestic governance, but for his brutal colonization of the Congo Free State, one of the most infamous episodes of European imperialism. Yet while Leopold's name became synonymous with greed and cruelty, his daughters became a footnote. In the family's early years, Belgium was a young kingdom, and its royal house was eager to establish dynastic links with the great powers of Europe. Stéphanie and her sisters were valuable assets in that ambition, and from an early age, her education was shaped by her role as a potential bride in the intricate network of European alliances. Her childhood was a mixture of privilege and constraint. As a royal princess, she lived surrounded by ceremony and discipline. The Belgian court was not as glamorous as those of Vienna or Paris, but it maintained the strict etiquette typical of the age. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, was of Austrian descent and brought with her the manners and expectations of the Habsburg world. It was under her influence that Stéphanie learned the importance of duty, decorum, and religion. She was taught to obey rather than to question, to endure rather than to rebel. These lessons, though typical for a royal daughter, would later determine much of her fate. When Stéphanie came of age, her father arranged her marriage to Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi. The match was intended to strengthen ties between Belgium and Austria, and at first glance, it seemed a brilliant alliance. Stéphanie, a young and devout princess, was joining one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Yet behind the facade of celebration, there was a great imbalance. Rudolf was older, more experienced, and already known for his restless nature. He was a man of intellectual curiosity and liberal ideas, but also of deep melancholy and personal conflict. The union was more political than emotional, and Stéphanie soon found herself caught between the rigid discipline of the imperial court and the unpredictable moods of her husband. Their marriage began with great ceremony in Vienna. The Habsburg court was one of the most formal in Europe, governed by traditions that left little room for warmth or spontaneity. Stéphanie's life there was bound by rules, from the way she dressed to the way she addressed others. She was expected to embody imperial virtue, but the reality behind the glitter was often cold and isolating. Empress Elizabeth, her mother-in-law, was famous for her beauty and eccentricity, but she was distant and aloof, often absent from court life. Emperor Franz Joseph was courteous but reserved, and his devotion to duty left little space for family intimacy. For a young bride like Stéphanie, the environment was intimidating. Her relationship with Rudolf deteriorated quickly. The crown prince had hoped for a partner who would share his intellectual and political interests, but Stéphanie had been raised in a sheltered world with limited education beyond religion and court etiquette. She was intelligent but unprepared for his restless and progressive spirit. Rudolf, frustrated by his father's conservatism and his own restricted role, turned to drinking, politics, and extramarital affairs. Stéphanie, meanwhile, struggled to find her place. She was faithful and dutiful, but her efforts to please her husband were often met with indifference. The emotional distance between them widened until it became irreparable. The birth of their only child, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, briefly offered a sense of purpose, but it could not repair their marriage. Not long after, Stéphanie's health was damaged by an illness she contracted from Rudolf, most likely a venereal disease, which left her unable to have more children. In the world of dynastic politics, this was a disaster. Her primary role as a royal wife was to produce heirs, and her inability to do so reduced her standing both at court and in her husband's eyes. The humiliation was compounded by gossip, and she began to live more like a tolerated figure than a cherished princess. Rudolf's own life was spiraling downward. His political frustrations and personal despair culminated in the tragedy at Marling in the late 19th century, when he was found dead alongside his young mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera. The event shocked Europe. It was both scandal and mystery, interpreted as either suicide or political conspiracy. For Stéphanie, it was an unbearable blow. She was only in her early 20s, and suddenly she was a widow at one of the most powerful courts in Europe. Yet instead of sympathy, she received blame. Some accused her of having failed her husband. Others simply ignored her as a reminder of a dark episode the dynasty wished to forget. After Rudolf's death, Stéphanie's position at court became untenable. The Habsburg family, always concerned with preserving appearances, preferred to distance itself from the tragedy. She was treated with cold politeness, but effectively excluded from influence. The emperor granted her a residence and a pension, but she was expected to live quietly, away from the center of power. In the eyes of Vienna, she was a symbol of failure, a princess who had not fulfilled her duty as wife or mother of a future emperor. The young widow, who had once stood beside the heir to one of Europe's greatest thrones, now found herself isolated and purposeless. Her later life marked a gradual retreat from imperial society. In time, she remarried, choosing Count Elemer Lonye, a Hungarian nobleman. The marriage shocked the aristocracy, for he was of lower rank, and the union was seen as a step down for a former crown princess. Yet for Stéphanie, it was an act of independence. For the first time, she married for affection rather than politics. She moved with her new husband to Hungary, where she adopted a quieter existence. Although she remained part of the extended aristocratic world, she was no longer bound by courtly expectations. Her second marriage allowed her a measure of happiness and stability, but it also deepened her obscurity. Detached from both the Belgian and Austrian courts, she became a marginal figure in European royalty. The press occasionally mentioned her, but mostly in passing. Unlike her mother-in-law Elizabeth, who became a romantic legend after her assassination, Stéphanie faded from public view. The world that had once celebrated her as a young archduchess now moved on without her. The reasons for her disappearance from historical memory are complex. Part of it lies in the way royal history is told. Historians and popular culture tend to focus on figures who either shaped political events or embodied dramatic narratives. Rudolf's tragic death made him a symbol of a decaying empire. Elizabeth became an icon of beauty and melancholy. Stéphanie, by contrast, represented neither revolution nor romance. She lived, suffered, and endured, but her life lacked the kind of theatrical quality that keeps a figure alive in memory. Her story was one of survival, not spectacle. Another reason lies in the gendered nature of historical remembrance. Women in royal circles were often defined by their relationships to men, fathers, husbands, or sons. Once those connections were broken or diminished, their visibility disappeared. Stéphanie's identity as Rudolf's wife and the emperor's daughter-in-law gave her significance. Once she lost those ties, her place in the narrative dissolved. Even her role as mother to Archduchess Elizabeth Marie did not ensure remembrance, for her daughter grew up to rebel against the Habsburg tradition, marrying a socialist and rejecting aristocratic life altogether. The break between mother and daughter was bitter, and it deprived Stéphanie of even that link to the dynastic story. Her later writings offer a glimpse into her mind and experiences. In her memoirs, published in the early 20th century, she portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, a woman trapped by duty and betrayed by those around her. The book was both self-justification and confession, filled with bitterness toward the Habsburg court, but also with moments of reflection. It revealed her intelligence and her awareness of how little power she had possessed within the rigid system of monarchy. Although some contemporaries dismissed her account as self-serving, it remains a valuable record of how an imperial marriage could suffocate individuality. In Hungary, Stéphanie lived through the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the First World War. The world that had defined her youth vanished almost overnight. Monarchies fell, aristocratic privileges crumbled, and Europe entered an age of upheaval. She and her husband retreated further into private life, residing in a castle far from political centers. The grand titles that once surrounded her meant little in a new era where kings and emperors were being replaced by republics. Yet she remained loyal to the idea of nobility, clinging to the manners and values of the past even as that world disappeared. Her final years were marked by seclusion and quiet dignity. She outlived her father, her mother, and most of those who had defined her early life. In old age, she was rarely seen in public, and when she died during the Second World War, her passing received little attention. The princess who had once been destined to become Empress of Austria was buried almost without notice. In the ruins of war-torn Europe, her name evoked little memory. To understand why history glossed over Stéphanie, one must consider how historical memory works. It is selective, driven by interest and symbolism rather than fairness. Figures who fit into larger narratives of power, rebellion, or tragedy are remembered. Those who do not are quietly set aside. Stéphanie's life did not alter the course of nations, nor did it inspire art or legend. She was a woman who fulfilled her duties, suffered personal misfortune, and then withdrew. Her experiences were emblematic of many royal women whose lives were defined by expectation rather than achievement. Her obscurity also reflects the transformation of European monarchy itself. During her lifetime, the idea of divine or hereditary right began to lose its hold. Monarchs became ceremonial, and public fascination shifted from political power to personal allure. Stéphanie lacked the charisma that could have made her a public icon. She was neither a reformer nor a rebel, and her virtues, duty, modesty, endurance, were precisely those that faded in appeal as modern values took hold. The world preferred the dramatic figure of Empress Elizabeth or the tragic allure of Rudolf. Stéphanie, steady and sorrowful, was too ordinary for legend. Yet this very ordinariness makes her story revealing. Through her we can see the pressures that shaped royal women in the 19th century. Her life demonstrates how little freedom they possessed, how their personal happiness was often sacrificed to political necessity. Her marriage was arranged not for love but for alliance. Her education prepared her for obedience, not for partnership. When that system failed her, she was left without identity or support. Her later decision to marry for affection was an act of quiet rebellion, though history rarely acknowledges it as such. In her letters and memoirs, one senses a deep desire for recognition, not as a royal figure, but as a person. She wrote with a mix of resentment and longing, conscious that her story had been overshadowed by others. There is a tragic dignity in her acceptance of obscurity, as though she knew that her fate was to be remembered only as a shadow in someone else's tale. When she criticized the Habsburg system, she did so not as a revolutionary, but as a disappointed insider. Her criticisms carried the weight of personal suffering rather than political ideology. Her relationship with her father, King Leopold II, also colored her later life. Although he was one of Europe's wealthiest and most notorious monarchs, their bond was distant. Leopold viewed his daughters as instruments of diplomacy, not as individuals with emotions and aspirations. Stéphanie's marriage to Rudolf was a political success for him, but he showed little sympathy when it ended in tragedy. His own reputation, already stained by the atrocities in the Congo, cast a shadow over his family. For Stéphanie, carrying the name of a man later condemned for such cruelty may have further diminished public interest in her. The world's judgment of Leopold left little room for compassion toward his daughter. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, was more sympathetic but equally constrained by her royal role. She shared her daughter's belief in duty and propriety, yet their relationship was not intimate. Both women lived within the emotional restraint demanded of queens and princesses. In this sense, Stéphanie inherited not only her mother's position but also her limitations. Their generation of royal women learned to suppress individuality in favor of decorum, and when the age changed, they found themselves out of step with a world that now valued authenticity and emotion. The vanishing of Stéphanie from popular history is therefore not a simple oversight, but the result of shifting values. The narratives that survive are those that resonate with contemporary sensibilities. In an age fascinated by rebellion, love, and tragedy, Stéphanie's endurance and restraint appear dull. Yet beneath that surface lies a profound human story. She was a woman of faith and principle who faced humiliation, loss, and isolation without surrendering her dignity. Her life illustrates how the mechanisms of monarchy could crush the individual spirit even within palaces of gold. If history has forgotten her, it is partly because she herself withdrew from it. Unlike other royal figures who sought publicity or influence, she preferred privacy. Her second marriage took her out of the public eye, and she made no effort to reclaim it. When the great empires of Europe fell, she did not attempt to return to power or seek sympathy from the public. She lived quietly, tending to her home and devoting herself to small acts of charity. Her humility, admirable as it was, ensured her disappearance from collective memory. Today, when historians look back on the late Habsburg era, Stéphanie appears as a supporting character in the tragedy of Marling. She is remembered, if at all, as the unfortunate wife of a doomed prince. Yet this narrow view does her an injustice. Her life extended far beyond that single event. She witnessed the transformation of Europe, the rise and fall of empires, and the birth of modernity. Through all of it, she remained a survivor, adapting to new realities while holding onto her sense of self. In that quiet endurance lies a different kind of heroism, one that history rarely rewards, but that deserves recognition. The story of Princess Stéphanie is not one of grandeur or revolution, but of resilience. She began as a daughter of a king, became the wife of a crown prince, and ended as a private countess in a world that had forgotten her. Her obscurity was not failure but consequence, a reflection of how societies remember what they wish to see and overlook what they cannot easily categorize. Her life challenges the idea that history's importance lies only in public achievement. Sometimes it lies in the quiet persistence of those who lived through change without losing their humanity. Her vanishing, then, is symbolic. It represents the erasure of countless women whose roles were vital yet uncelebrated. Stéphanie's obscurity is not merely a personal fate, but part of a broader historical pattern in which female experiences are sidelined. To glimpse her story is to acknowledge those lives that existed in the margins of power, shaping history not through command, but through endurance. Princess Stéphanie's legacy remains faint, but it offers a rare perspective on an era often defined by grandeur and tragedy. She was neither heroine nor villain, but a human being shaped by circumstance. Her journey from the splendor of Vienna to the quiet fields of Hungary is a reminder that behind the facades of monarchy lay real lives, filled with longing, disappointment, and small acts of courage. In rediscovering her, we do not rewrite history but enrich it, adding depth to our understanding of how individuals, especially women, navigated the rigid structures of the past. The story of Stéphanie is one of disappearance, not through death or scandal, but through the slow erosion of memory. Her life, once intertwined with the fate of empires, slipped away from public consciousness as the world moved on. Yet her obscurity holds its own truth. It speaks of how history values spectacle over substance, and how many of those who lived with quiet strength are left unnamed in its pages. Remembering her is a small act of justice, restoring to view a woman who, though forgotten, once stood at the heart of Europe's most powerful dynasty. The story of Princess Stéphanie, though wrapped in tragedy and silence, still carries threads of intrigue that extend beyond her fading presence in the grand chronicles of Europe. Behind the quiet obedience expected of her, there were glimpses of a mind more perceptive and a will more complex than the surface of history suggests. Beneath her calm demeanor and the layers of royal decorum, there existed an undercurrent of intelligence, suppressed ambition, and subtle resistance. Her outward compliance often concealed a capacity for observation and understanding that few within the imperial court noticed. In that tension between appearance and inner life lies the real fascination of her story. The suggestion that even within the narrow confines of monarchy, she possessed a certain power, though it had to remain hidden. From her earliest years, Stéphanie had been trained to obey, not to act. Yet within those boundaries, she developed an awareness of how influence worked among royals. Power in her world was rarely exercised through open assertion. It flowed through small gestures, alliances, and silences. For women, especially, power existed in what could be implied rather than declared. A word at the right moment, a sympathetic ear to the right person, or even a graceful withdrawal from conflict could carry weight in ways the men around them never acknowledged. Stéphanie learned this unspoken language early, first within her father's household in Belgium and later within the immense and watchful structure of the Habsburg court. Her position as both observer and participant gave her insight into the mechanisms of control that ruled every aspect of imperial life. The Austrian court into which she married was among the most rigid in Europe. It was a world where hierarchy governed everything from conversation to posture. Every movement, every encounter followed rules drawn from centuries of ceremony. The purpose of such precision was to maintain order and reinforce the image of divine authority that sustained the empire. Yet behind the public formality, the court functioned as a closed society where favor and influence depended on subtleties that were invisible to outsiders. It was a theater of gestures, where expressions and pauses often meant more than words. Women, though denied official roles, played a crucial part in maintaining this delicate balance. They were expected to embody grace, modesty, and silence, yet they were also the ones who carried information, softened tempers, and shaped the moods of powerful men. When Stéphanie first entered this world, she did so as a young bride overwhelmed by its grandeur and rules. Every element of her daily life was predetermined. The hour she rose, the people she could speak to, even the distance she was expected to maintain when walking beside her husband. The imperial household was governed by an official known as the Obersthofmeister, who enforced etiquette with the precision of law. To disobey even minor customs was to risk censure and disgrace. Stéphanie soon realized that this structure left little room for individuality. The women around her, ladies-in-waiting, duchesses and archduchesses, spoke in tones of measured politeness that masked competition and resentment. Affection was rare, sincerity even rarer. Yet within this suffocating order, Stéphanie began to notice the spaces where authority faltered. She saw how Empress Elizabeth, despite being admired and obeyed, resisted the court by absence. Elizabeth's refusal to conform, her long absences from Vienna, and her preference for travel and solitude revealed a form of defiance that did not break the system but exposed its fragility. Stéphanie lacked her mother-in-law's charisma, but she understood the lesson, that silence and withdrawal could sometimes be weapons. When Rudolf turned away from her and the court whispered about her failures, she did not protest publicly. Instead, she cultivated composure, a restraint that some mistook for weakness, but which gave her a quiet dignity the gossipers could not easily touch. In a setting where everything was meant to appear flawless, the smallest deviation carried meaning. Stéphanie's way of managing her isolation was to observe rather than to challenge. She became sensitive to the moods of those around her, reading intentions that were never spoken aloud. Through this awareness, she preserved her self-respect even when her influence waned. The court valued perfection of manner over sincerity of feeling, and she learned to use that expectation to protect herself. The same grace that made her seem submissive also allowed her to withdraw from humiliation without open conflict. In that restraint lay her form of power, the power of endurance and of perception. The rigid world of the Habsburgs left no room for spontaneous emotion. Every woman at court was an emblem of propriety, and their lives revolved around the emperor's schedule. Meals, audiences, and ceremonies followed a rhythm that had not changed in generations. The palace itself reflected this order: long corridors, silent servants, heavy curtains that shut out light and sound. The architecture of the Hofburg symbolized authority that was as cold as marble. For Stéphanie, who had grown up in a smaller and more intimate Belgian court, this formality was daunting. The grandeur that had once inspired us soon became a kind of imprisonment. She once wrote that she felt surrounded by invisible walls. The phrase captures the essence of her life there, not physical confinement, but a cage built of expectations. The unwritten rules for women were even more suffocating than the visible ones. They were expected to embody devotion without expression, beauty without vanity, and intelligence without ambition. A royal woman's value lay in her ability to support her husband without overshadowing him. Yet in a court filled with intrigue, such passivity often left them vulnerable. Stéphanie saw how other women, deprived of real authority, used charm or manipulation to gain small advantages. Some cultivated friendships with influential courtiers, others flattered the emperor's officials, and a few turned to spiritual advisors who doubled as political intermediaries. These strategies, though often dismissed as feminine games, were the only means available to exert control within a patriarchal structure. Stéphanie, however, was ill-suited to play such games. Her upbringing had emphasized piety and sincerity. She lacked the flirtatious confidence that could have helped her navigate the rivalries of the Viennese aristocracy. Her honesty, though admirable, made her appear naive. Many courtiers treated her with condescension, assuming she would accept her role without question. Yet her apparent docility concealed a growing awareness of injustice. She began to see how the empire's stability depended on the suppression of individuality, not only among subjects but within the royal family itself. Her husband's despair, her mother-in-law's escape, and her own humiliation were all symptoms of a system that valued control over humanity. The imperial court demanded appearances of harmony even when the truth was discord. When Rudolf's moods darkened and his political frustrations deepened, Stéphanie was expected to smile beside him in public to maintain the image of a perfect marriage. When she fell ill and could no longer bear children, she was expected to accept her diminished status with grace. Each act of compliance reinforced the image of a virtuous consort, but inside she must have felt the weight of her erasure. Still, she continued to fulfill her duties with precision. In doing so, she maintained a kind of moral superiority over those who whispered against her. Her adherence to form became both shield and prison. Within the confines of that life, there were still moments when she glimpsed what might have been possible had she been free. During travels with Rudolf, she met diplomats, scholars, and artists who represented the more progressive world beyond Vienna. Some of them spoke with her as an equal, noting her intelligence and curiosity. She listened to discussions about reform, science, and the changing shape of Europe. Though she could not take part in politics, these encounters revealed her capacity for thought that extended beyond the narrow role assigned to her. It was as if she saw through a window into a broader existence that she could never fully enter. The contradiction between her potential and her position created an inner tension that remained throughout her life. The same system that denied her freedom also depended on her composure. She was expected to embody an ideal that denied her humanity. Yet she endured without open rebellion, perhaps because she understood the futility of confronting such a vast and ancient institution. Her form of resistance was internal, the preservation of dignity in the face of subjugation. It was not dramatic, but it was profound. Many of her contemporaries mistook her calm for resignation, but it was closer to defiance by endurance. In her later reflections, she hinted that she had seen more than people realized. Her memoirs contain observations about hypocrisy, vanity, and fear within the imperial family. She described how those in high places were prisoners of their own prestige, unable to speak honestly or act freely. Her tone was not bitter so much as analytical. She wrote as someone who had lived inside the machinery of monarchy and understood its cost. In that sense, her suppressed power lay in insight rather than in action. She recognized truths that others, including her husband, could not bear to face. Rudolf's despair and eventual destruction were in part the result of his inability to reconcile ideals with reality. Stéphanie, less visionary but more resilient, saw the same truth and survived it. The imperial court itself functioned like a living organism whose health depended on secrecy. Every misfortune was concealed, every scandal softened, every emotion suppressed. Women were expected to contribute to this illusion by embodying serenity, even when surrounded by turmoil. Stéphanie played her part well enough to avoid open disgrace, but not so well as to gain admiration. Her tragedy was that she existed between worlds, too upright to manipulate the court and too confined to escape it. Her intelligence, unrecognized and unused, became a private burden. The strength of her mind had nowhere to go. That quiet frustration shaped her later years more than any public event. Despite the restrictions, small traces of her individuality emerged in her charitable work. She supported hospitals and schools, causes considered suitable for women of her rank, but she approached them with sincerity rather than vanity. Her involvement was personal, not decorative. Unlike many royals who lent their names to projects they never visited, she took an interest in the people behind them. These efforts, though modest, reveal her attempt to find purpose within the boundaries imposed upon her. It was another form of quiet power, the ability to do good without seeking recognition. In understanding her life at court, it is also important to see how the imperial environment distorted relationships. Genuine affection was difficult to sustain amid so much formality. Trust was rare, and every conversation could carry political consequences. Stéphanie's marriage suffered not only from personal incompatibility, but from this broader atmosphere of surveillance and expectation. Even the emperor and empress lived under the weight of public scrutiny that left little space for intimacy. In such a setting, love and loyalty often gave way to fear and calculation. For a sensitive and sincere woman like Stéphanie, this must have felt like living in a permanent masquerade. Her father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph, was the embodiment of duty. To him, personal feelings were secondary to service. He valued obedience and stability above all else. Stéphanie's virtues of patience and composure should have appealed to him, yet he regarded her with the same distant politeness he offered to everyone. She could never win his affection because affection itself was a form of weakness in his eyes. The emperor's example set the tone for the entire court. Affection was dangerous, individuality suspicious. Thus, even kindness became formalized, reduced to gestures devoid of warmth. The same dynamic extended to the women of the imperial family. Each lived under the gaze of attendants and officials. Their correspondence was monitored, their movements recorded. A simple visit could become the subject of rumor. Under such scrutiny, genuine friendship was almost impossible. Stéphanie, who valued sincerity, found herself surrounded by pretense. Over time, this isolation deepened her introspection. The woman who had once been groomed to charm and please began instead to observe and reflect. Her apparent passivity masked a growing detachment from the values of the world around her. That detachment, however, did not mean she was indifferent. On the contrary, it was a defense against pain. By the time tragedy struck at Marling, she had already withdrawn emotionally from her husband's turmoil. She could see his self-destruction coming, but was powerless to prevent it. The court's secrecy and Rudolf's own despair left her outside the circle of events that determined her fate. Afterward, the same machinery that had controlled her life erased her presence from the story. The empire needed a narrative that preserved dignity, and in that narrative, she became almost invisible. Her silence after the tragedy was not mere submission, it was also protection. Speaking openly could only have invited more blame. In the years that followed, she carried the lessons of that silence with her. When she left Vienna, she did not denounce the court, but quietly disengaged from it. Her later writings show that she had no illusions about its cruelty or hypocrisy, but she also understood its logic. She recognized that the court's rigidity was both its strength and its weakness, that the same rules that had once made the empire powerful were now sealing its decline. Her insight into this paradox gives her story a historical dimension that goes beyond personal misfortune. She witnessed, from within, the beginning of the end of an era. The image of Stéphanie as merely the forgotten widow of a tragic prince does not capture this complexity. Beneath the layers of protocol and propriety, she embodied a form of suppressed power that defies simple definition. It was not political influence or romantic allure, but the endurance of a mind that refused to surrender completely to the roles assigned to it. Her life at the imperial court revealed the hidden strength of women who, though denied authority, preserved their sense of identity in silence. That was her quiet victory, one that history has overlooked, but that remains visible to those who read between the lines of her life. Her years in Vienna, confined by etiquette yet rich in observation, laid the foundation for the independence she later claimed in Hungary. The same composure that had once protected her from gossip later allowed her to adapt to a humbler but freer existence. The rigid world of the Habsburgs had taught her the price of submission and the value of self-knowledge. By enduring it without bitterness, she transformed restraint into understanding. Her suppressed power was not the power to command others, but the deeper one of knowing herself amid forces that sought to erase her. In that quiet realization lies the continuity between her life at court and her later obscurity. The same qualities that made her invisible to history, her restraint, her honesty, her refusal to perform, were also the qualities that defined her strength. In the end, she did not conquer the empire that confined her, but she survived it with her integrity intact. That survival, though it left her forgotten in the public memory, stands as proof that even in the most rigid systems, the human spirit finds ways to endure and to see beyond the walls that surround it. The arc of Stéphanie's life after she withdrew from the imperial stage reveals an evolution that few anticipated. The woman once dismissed as a mere casualty of royal misfortune began to demonstrate a quieter kind of influence, one that operated beyond the formal boundaries of title and rank. In this phase of her story, she no longer appeared as a passive figure in the pageantry of dynastic politics, but as an individual who learned to navigate her surroundings with deliberate calculation. What makes her ascent so remarkable is that it unfolded in subtle ways, without official recognition, and without the support that royal women usually required to maintain relevance. The traditional image of a royal bride defined by obedience, beauty, and lineage could not contain her reality. Stéphanie was different. Her influence came not from display, but from intellect, endurance, and the ability to see through the illusions that bound her world together. In the context of European monarchy, royal marriages were instruments of diplomacy. Princesses were trained to unite houses, reinforce alliances, and serve as symbols of continuity. Their personal desires were often irrelevant. They were expected to maintain grace and silence, ensuring the smooth functioning of an order that left them little agency. Those who adapted became invisible parts of the system. Those who resisted were branded as difficult. Stéphanie entered this world aware of its expectations, yet her life did not follow its predictable pattern. Her journey through disgrace and retreat gave her a unique perspective. She had known the pomp of Vienna and the isolation of exile. She had been both celebrated and dismissed. From that dual experience, she developed a rare independence of mind. When she settled in Hungary with her second husband, she found herself in a new environment, still aristocratic, but less constrained by the suffocating etiquette of Vienna. In this quieter sphere, she began to observe the transformation of Europe with a sharper eye. The collapse of empires and the rise of new political movements forced former royals to reconsider their identities. Many clung to fading privileges, while others sought refuge in nostalgia. Stéphanie, however, adapted. She did not attempt to reclaim her lost grandeur. Instead, she rebuilt her life around a sense of self that had little to do with rank. That decision alone set her apart from most of her contemporaries. It was the beginning of a different kind of ascent, one rooted in understanding rather than position. Her reputation within Hungarian society was complicated. To some, she remained the foreign widow of a tragic prince. To others, she was a woman of surprising intelligence who carried herself with calm dignity. Unlike many exiled royals, she did not surround herself with flatterers or seek to create a miniature court. She preferred a small circle of confidants, people chosen for their loyalty rather than their titles. Among them were scholars, local officials, and a few women of similar temperament who had also experienced the decline of aristocratic life. These relationships became the foundation of her informal network, a network that functioned not through command but through mutual respect. Her ability to connect with individuals outside the traditional aristocracy reflected both humility and strategy. She understood that the old systems of influence were dying, and she quietly positioned herself within the emerging social order. What made Stéphanie distinct from the typical royal woman of her time was her capacity to evolve. Many who were born to power could not imagine life without it. They mistook ceremony for significance and could not survive once stripped of courtly privileges. Stephanie, by contrast, discovered freedom in her loss. The withdrawal from public duties allowed her to cultivate qualities that the imperial court had suppressed: independence of thought, empathy, and discretion. Over time, these became her instruments of influence. People began to seek her advice not because of her title, but because of her understanding. Those who visited her in Hungary often remarked on her insight into human behavior. She had lived long enough among courtiers to recognize motives beneath manners, and she used that knowledge to guide her dealings with others. Her strategic mind began to reveal itself in subtle ways. She had learned from her years in Vienna that power in royal circles rarely depended on formal authority. It moved through conversation, hospitality, and information. Though she was no longer part of the imperial court, she remained connected to many who were. Letters from old acquaintances, diplomats, and relatives provided her with a constant flow of news. She answered with care, balancing warmth with discretion. Through this correspondence, she maintained relevance in circles that might otherwise have forgotten her. It was not the power of command but of knowledge, the quiet power of someone who knew both the inner workings of monarchy and the temperament of those who served it. One of her strengths was the ability to listen. In a world where many spoke only to be heard, Stephanie's silence became a tool. People confided in her because they sensed she would not betray them. She had lived through scandal and understood the value of restraint. In her Hungarian estate, visitors found a listener who neither judged nor gossiped. For politicians and courtiers navigating the uncertain years after the fall of the empire, such a presence was rare. She offered perspective without ambition. Over time, her home became a discreet meeting place where conversations could occur without the formality of Vienna or the suspicion of Budapest. Through these exchanges, she quietly influenced opinions, encouraging moderation in an age of extremes. Stephanie's understanding of power was shaped by her earlier disillusionment. The tragedies of her youth had stripped away illusions about nobility and destiny. She knew that titles could vanish overnight, and that human dignity did not depend on crown or court. This clarity gave her both humility and confidence. When she advised others, she spoke from experience rather than theory. Her insight carried weight precisely because it came from someone who had seen both the heights of privilege and the depths of disgrace. It was in this sense that her ascent differed from that of traditional royal figures. She rose not through ceremony or marriage, but through wisdom gained from suffering. Even in her seclusion, she maintained a careful awareness of European politics. Her correspondence reveals an interest in the changes sweeping across the continent. The emergence of new nations, the decline of aristocratic power, and the shifting role of monarchy in modern society. She read widely and stayed informed. Though she no longer held influence in an official sense, she understood the importance of ideas. The lessons she drew from her past gave her a unique vantage point from which to interpret the present. She had seen firsthand how rigidity could destroy dynasties, and she sympathized with reformers who sought to adapt monarchy to modern life. At the same time, she remained conservative in temperament, believing in order and tradition, but not at the cost of humanity. This balance between old and new defined her later thought and made her a quiet but respected voice among those who still valued the wisdom of experience. In the years after the Great War, when former emperors and kings struggled to find purpose, Stephanie's composure stood out. She neither lamented the loss of empire nor sought to revive it. Her ability to accept change without bitterness impressed those who met her. Some historians have described this period as her second transformation, the moment when she ceased to be defined by her past and began to shape her own narrative. That transformation was not dramatic but steady, born of reflection and resilience. The woman who had once been constrained by the strictest etiquette had learned to live by her own principles, quietly building a life of meaning from the remnants of a vanished world. Her growing influence in Hungarian society was not measured by public recognition, but by the respect she commanded privately. Local leaders often sought her opinion on social projects or charitable work. She supported causes related to education and the welfare of women, drawing on her own experiences of constraint. Her involvement in these efforts showed an awareness of how the roles of women were changing in the new century. She encouraged independence and learning, believing that knowledge was the only true security in uncertain times. These initiatives were modest in scale, but significant in spirit. They represented her belief that progress did not depend on revolution, but on steady improvement guided by compassion. Within her small circle, She also acted as mentor to younger women of noble birth who struggled to adapt to their reduced circumstances. Many of them had been raised, like her, to expect lives of privilege and ceremony, only to find themselves in a world that no longer valued such things. Stéphanie's guidance emphasized dignity, practicality, and inner strength. She taught by example that self-worth did not depend on recognition. Her ability to inspire confidence in others was part of her hidden influence. Through quiet conversation and example, she helped preserve a sense of continuity during a period of disorientation. Her strength was not in commanding loyalty, but in nurturing resilience. It was during these years that hints of her strategic mind became most evident. Although she rarely engaged in overt politics, she understood how to protect her position within a changing society. She maintained cordial relations with both conservative and progressive circles without fully aligning with either. Her neutrality allowed her to act as mediator when disputes arose among local elites. This role suited her temperament and experience. Having witnessed the destructive consequences of conflict within the Habsburg family, she valued reconciliation above victory. Those who dealt with her often remarked on her fairness and her ability to see both sides of an issue. In a time when political divisions ran deep, such balance was rare. Her ability to sustain respect from multiple groups reflected her understanding of how influence truly operated. It was not about domination but about perception. She knew that credibility came from consistency and integrity, not from force. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she did not exaggerate her past importance. She spoke of her former life without bitterness or vanity. This honesty made her trustworthy, and trust was the foundation of her quiet authority. People who entered her circle often came away with a renewed sense of perspective. Her conversation, marked by clarity and calm, contrasted sharply with the hysteria that surrounded much of post-war Europe. In her writings and later correspondence, traces of her analytical ability become clear. She reflected on how monarchy could have survived had it adapted sooner. She saw that rigid protocol had not only stifled personal happiness, but also blinded rulers to the needs of their people. She believed that compassion and intelligence were as essential to leadership as tradition. These views, though moderate, were forward-looking for her time. They show that beneath her reserved exterior, there was a mind that questioned the very foundations of the system that had shaped her life. She did not reject monarchy outright, but she sought to humanize it, to strip it of its pretensions and restore its moral purpose. In this sense, her perspective foreshadowed the constitutional monarchies that later emerged in Europe. The idea that Stéphanie had no influence because she lacked public power is misleading. Her influence lay in the realm of ideas, in her ability to reinterpret her past and offer lessons to a changing world. She demonstrated that wisdom could survive the fall of empires, and that dignity did not depend on ceremony. By deconstructing the conventional narrative of royal brides, she redefined what it meant to be a woman of rank. She was not a passive participant in the dynastic exchange, but a witness who learned from it, absorbed its lessons, and then transcended it. Her life challenged the assumption that royal women were destined only to reflect the will of others. Instead, she showed that understanding itself could be a form of power. Her correspondence with former courtiers and diplomats provides evidence of her continuing influence. She was often consulted about personal and political matters, particularly when discretion was required. Her advice was valued precisely because she had no official role and thus no ambition to manipulate outcomes. Her judgment, tempered by loss and experience, carried authority. Through these quiet connections, she maintained a presence in European affairs long after her name had disappeared from the newspapers. Her hidden network, formed of correspondents, friends, and sympathetic officials, functioned as an informal web of communication between old and new worlds. It was invisible to the public, but effective in shaping attitudes and maintaining stability during turbulent times. This network was not the product of conspiracy or ambition, but of trust. Those who reached out to her did so because they believed in her discretion. She had learned, through painful experience, that reputation depended more on what one did not say than on what one proclaimed. Her understanding of secrecy, born in the rigid confines of the imperial court, became her greatest asset in later life. By respecting confidences, she built influence that no title could grant. Even as monarchies fell and new governments rose, she remained a quiet presence in the background, reminding those who sought her counsel that stability depended on character as much as on power. Her path to influence, then, was neither direct nor visible. It unfolded through years of reflection, adaptation, and careful relationship building. The woman once constrained by ceremonial obligation had transformed into a figure of quiet authority, guided not by ambition but by insight. Her ascent was inward rather than outward, marked by growth of understanding rather than accumulation of status. It stands as a counterpoint to the conventional story of royal success, where visibility and command define achievement. Stéphanie's story reveals that true influence often works unseen, in the spaces between words, in the patience of endurance, and in the wisdom of restraint. By the time she reached her later years, the transformation was complete. The world around her had changed beyond recognition, yet she remained steady. Visitors to her home in Hungary described an atmosphere of calm and order, a reflection of the balance she had achieved within herself. She no longer sought approval from dynasties or courts. Her power came from the clarity of her own conscience. When she looked back on her life, she saw not failure but survival, a survival that had meaning because it had been achieved with integrity. Her ascent was not to a throne but to self-mastery. In the larger tapestry of European history, her presence may seem small, yet it embodies a truth that grander figures often overlook. Power without understanding fades quickly, but understanding endures. Stéphanie's quiet evolution from obedient princess to independent thinker illustrates how resilience can turn misfortune into insight. She rose not through rebellion, but through reflection, not by breaking the rules, but by learning to see through them. Her life stands as a reminder that even within the most rigid systems, there are spaces where intelligence and humanity can flourish. That is the enigma of her ascent. It happened not despite her loss of status, but because of it. Even after her second marriage, slowly removed from the glare of imperial ceremony, Stéphanie never quite lost her sense of presence. She shifted the stage from courts and throne rooms to private estates and charitable work. In those quieter places she quietly shaped opinions, built alliances, and in unexpected ways affected how people around her acted. Her power seldom appeared in laws or decrees. More often it showed through gestures, caring choices, influence over people who did act, and small but meaningful decisions that rippled outward. In Vienna, before the turbulence of Marling and the end of her first marriage, Stéphanie had already begun to show how influence could be subtle. When Empress Elizabeth, Cece, resisted official functions, Stéphanie was sometimes given parts of those responsibilities. Even though she was still young, she begged to be relieved from some of them, aware that stepping too eagerly into empress-like duties risked drawing criticism. Her hesitation, however, became in itself a sign to the court that she was not merely decorative, she was thoughtful. Her letters, too, became tools. After the catastrophe at Marling, when Rudolf's death shocked the empire, Stéphanie's reaction in writing showed more than grief. In her private correspondence, she expressed anger, confusion, and suffering, but also a sense of responsibility. She asked whether she might have done things differently, not as public confession, but private reckoning. That act of asking, of confronting her role and her feelings, changed how some of her associates viewed her. It made her less of a passive victim and more of a person who wrestled with difficult realities. When political and dynastic tensions rose, Stéphanie often navigated them quietly. She retained contacts in Vienna, Belgium, and Hungary, exchanging letters with those still engaged in the court. These relationships kept her informed and allowed her to act as a go-between. For example, through her husband Elmer Lonier, she connected with Hungarian aristocrats and conservative politicians. Through her birth family, she had lingering ties with Belgian royalty. She was in position to hear what each side thought and to influence where she could, to smooth over misunderstandings, to send messages, not for spectacle, but to preserve dignity or to avoid conflict. Her existing loyalty to tradition did not blind her to change. She saw what was possible, what was breaking, and chose when to intervene. Her work in social causes also provided opportunity to influence. During the First World War, she converted her castle at Oros into a Red Cross hospital for wounded soldiers. On the ground, working closely with nurses, doctors, and local leaders, she gained respect. That kind of reputation matters in societies where people often judge only by status. Her efforts for mothers and infants, her involvement with orphans and widows of teachers, these were not grand political acts, but they built social trust. Through them she had moral authority, especially among those who saw suffering firsthand. When social stability was fragile, moral examples counted. Her estate in Rozovs also became an informal center of culture and discussion. She and her husband collected art, hosted guests from old aristocratic circles, scholars, visitors from Habsburg families in exile. By maintaining those connections, sending gifts, correspondence, by being a benefactor, she kept alive the networks that bound the old monarchy even after its practical power waned. Her house was a place where people who had lost power did not feel entirely abandoned. Those ties mattered. When Otto von Habsburg was orphaned or in exile, Stephanie and her husband sent support. It was not recorded in treaties, but it built goodwill. In more than one instance, Stephanie used her influence over private individuals to affect public outcomes. She often intervened quietly in family matters. For example, when her daughter Archduchess Elizabeth Marie began to clash with Habsburg expectations, Stephanie's approach was complex. She would both care as a mother and protect her own reputation and interests. In time, she disinherited her daughter in 1934. This was not done out of sheer harshness, but out of concern for dynastic respect, social perception, and preserving what dignity remained. That action demonstrates the delicate balancing of emotional ties, power, legacy, and reputation. She also navigated her loss of titles and official position in ways that preserved influence. After she remarried, the emperor stripped her of imperial titles. Yet Stephanie did not vanish entirely. At Rozovs, she hosted people, cultivated relationships with powerful exiled royals and aristocrats, maintained correspondence with them. She used those relationships to remain part of the conversation on what should happen to monarchy in Europe, what role aristocracy might still play, and how traditions might be preserved or adapted. Her husband's elevation in 1917 to hereditary prince by Emperor Charles I gave her a renewed symbolic standing. While the empire was collapsing, this act affirmed that the Habsburg critical circles continued to view her with respect. She was no longer a crown princess, but she had become part of the lineage of those who remained involved in dynastic questions. At times her influence came through symbolic acts rather than force. Wearing Hungarian dress, giving speeches in Hungarian, learning the language, publicly showing respect for Hungarian culture, these were not inconsequential. They sent signals about loyalty, identity, and alignment in a fragmented empire. When she visited houses in Hungary or took up Hungarian causes, it reinforced bonds between aristocrats and the people, between old rulers and subjects who might no longer see monarchy as inevitable. Her role in patronage of cultural and charitable institutions helped sustain social networks which monarchist or conservative groups could count on. These acts were parts of a larger social web. Her letters from Marling, from moments of public crisis, also show influence in a different form. After Rudolf died, the way she responded, dignified, measured, refusing to assign simple blame or inflame scandal, helped calm some of the worst turmoil in Vienna. While many in the court whispered accusations, Stephanie's responses, including through private correspondence, insisted on responsibility, suffering loss. This posture made it harder for powerful figures to marginalize her utterly. She became someone whose integrity people felt obliged to reckon with. It is harder to ignore someone when they refuse to be defeated by scandal. Another example, during the collapse of Austro-Hungarian Empire after the First World War, society around her was fractured. She was not a soldier or a general, but she could intervene morally. Her support for young royal exiles, for preserving archives and correspondence, for maintaining estates, for refusing to abandon responsibilities, all left traces. In a time of tumult, people remembered those who acted decently. She may not have changed borders or held political office, but she influenced how people thought about monarchy, about nobility, about continuity. Her life, in that sense, contributed to preserving institutions and cultural memory when many were abandoning them or destroying them. Her relationship with powerful figures shows more than just connections, it shows leverage. She was in dispute with her father early on over her second marriage. Her insistence over time on marrying for affection with Launier signaled her own refusal to remain merely a pawn in dynastic trading. Though the emperor was horrified and titles were stripped, she did not yield. That required strength. She didn't confront the emperor with speech or public outrage. She worked through private negotiation, persistence, dignified appeals, loyalty to some traditions while rejecting others. That alone shifted how some saw her. Not just as a tragic remnant, but as someone who could assert personal choices even under enormous pressure. Her memory work, her memoirs, and preserving letters, especially Rudolf's farewell letter, and choosing what to publish, was another form of power play. By controlling how she told her story, she shaped how history would remember her. Rudolf's farewell letter, published in her memoirs in the 1930s, gave the public a view inside tragedy. Her framing of her role, her suffering, and what might have caused events carried weight. That book, I Was to Be Empress, was censored at first, but she persisted. The decision to publish and what to publish was itself an act of influence over the narrative. Her covert influence lay exactly in these kinds of acts: moral authority, host of networks, symbolic loyalty, cultural patronage, resisting erasure, and shaping memory. Her power was not loud, it was often indirect. Yet those who met her or corresponded with her knew she was more than a ghost of an empire. She had presence. She had choices. In a time of transition and decay for many monarchies in Europe, that kind of subtle influence, built on integrity, matters as much as more visible power. In the years following her quiet withdrawal from the imperial stage, Stéphanie carried more than memories of court life. She carried scars, emotional, reputational, and spiritual, that shaped the remainder of her existence. Her story of survival is not only about endurance, but about the cost of remaining whole after betrayal, scandal, and isolation. For those who only saw the surface, the calm dignity of the widowed crown princess turned Hungarian countess. Her later peace seemed the natural end to misfortune. But beneath that calm lay a history of wounds reopened by every whisper that followed her name. The court in Vienna was never forgiving to women who fell out of favor. Once the brilliance of youth faded and influence slipped away, the same courtiers who once bowed in reverence began to whisper. Stéphanie learned this lesson harshly. After Rudolf's death, she was treated less as a grieving widow and more as a reminder of tragedy that the imperial family wanted to forget. Rumors spread through salons and corridors. Some said she had failed as a wife, others that her coldness had driven Rudolf to despair. Few cared for truth. Gossip satisfied a court that thrived on it. These unkind stories reached foreign newspapers, and her isolation deepened. For a woman raised to serve the image of perfection, to be branded as a cause of disgrace was unbearable. Yet Stéphanie chose silence. She did not defend herself publicly, understanding that protest only fed rumor. Still, the silence came at a personal cost. She wrote in private letters that she felt surrounded by hostility and indifference. She grieved not only for her husband, but also for the destruction of her own name. That kind of social death within a living world demanded extraordinary restraint. Each smile at a reception, each carefully measured word, each formal bow before the Empress became an act of will rather than habit. Her relationship with Empress Elizabeth, always delicate, turned colder. Elizabeth, whose own grief for Rudolf was bound to guilt and distance, avoided Stéphanie. Between the two women lay a silent wall of blame neither could voice. Stéphanie respected her mother-in-law's sorrow, but suffered under her aloofness. Within the imperial palace, every glance and every pause in conversation carried hidden meaning. She became a figure watched but not comforted. That solitude left her vulnerable to intrigue. Some courtiers saw advantage in her vulnerability. There were subtle efforts to discredit her, not through open accusation, but through small manipulations of perception. Servants were moved, confidants replaced, correspondence delayed or intercepted. Those who had once courted her favor now aligned themselves with others. In this atmosphere, trust became rare. She learned to weigh every friendship against potential betrayal. That instinct, born of necessity, later shaped her survival in exile. She learned to read motives behind politeness, to anticipate the malice that hides behind sympathy. When she returned to Belgium to visit her family, she found no true refuge there either. Her father, King Leopold, was a man known for calculation more than warmth. He treated her less as a daughter and more as an instrument whose value had diminished. His correspondence about her reflected disappointment that her marriage had not brought greater advantage. The gulf between them widened when she expressed her wish to remarry. To Leopold, this was folly. He saw the union with Eleanor Lonier as a step down, a threat to dynastic dignity. Stéphanie's insistence on marrying for affection after years of submission enraged him. The scandal of her second marriage became one of the most painful chapters of her life. The Habsburg court saw it as betrayal of imperial decorum. To marry a Hungarian count, noble but not royal, was to abandon the hierarchy that defined her existence. Emperor Franz Joseph's reaction was swift and formal. Stéphanie was stripped of her imperial titles and removed from the role of archduchesses. For a woman who had once been groomed to stand beside a future emperor, The humiliation was severe. But beneath that punishment lay a quieter triumph. She had chosen her own path, defying a system that valued obedience above all else. Yet even that freedom carried cost. The loss of her title meant loss of protection. She and her husband were viewed with suspicion by both Viennese aristocracy and Hungarian elites. Invitations ceased, friends hesitated. There were whispers that Lonier had married her for wealth, that she sought influence through him, that their marriage was an act of rebellion. Stéphanie endured it with the same poise she had learned in Vienna, but in private she suffered deeply. Her letters from this period reveal bitterness toward the court's hypocrisy and sorrow for being cut off from her daughter. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, known for her fiery nature, grew increasingly estranged. Their relationship became one of Stéphanie's deepest personal wounds. The young archduchess resented her mother's authority and gravitated toward socialist ideals that shocked the family. When she married a man far below her rank, Stéphanie's despair turned to fury. Their quarrels became public, and the press feasted on the rift. Mother and daughter stopped speaking. Stéphanie's decision to disinherit her was not made from cruelty, but from exhaustion. Years of tension, disappointment, and betrayal had broken whatever bond remained. The court took grim satisfaction in this drama. It confirmed, in their eyes, that Stéphanie was unlucky, perhaps cursed. Even those who had once sympathized began to turn away, fearing that association with her brought misfortune. She understood that pity was often a mask for judgment. In this climate, secrecy became her shield. She and Lonier withdrew to their estate at Rozovs, turning it into both refuge and fortress. There, she began a life defined by deliberate privacy. Visitors were chosen carefully, correspondence guarded closely, servants trusted only after long observation. The world around her changed violently. The Great War shattered the empire she had once belonged to. Stéphanie's position was precarious. Her Belgian origins placed her in an awkward light within Hungary, while her Habsburg past made her suspect in Allied eyes. She navigated these dangers through tact. During the war, she devoted herself to nursing and relief work, transforming parts of her estate into a hospital. Her service won her respect locally, but she knew that even good deeds could be twisted into suspicion. She avoided political statements, speaking instead of duty, compassion, and faith. The collapse of the monarchy in 1918 brought another wave of uncertainty. Many former royals fled or lost their estates. Stéphanie and her husband managed to keep theirs, largely through careful diplomacy and the goodwill she had earned through charity. But survival required more than luck. She had to negotiate quietly with new authorities, assure them of her loyalty, and distance herself from monarchist conspiracies. Those who remembered her composure during court crises now saw it serve her in political turmoil. Where others raged or pleaded, she remained calm, offering reason and courtesy. This composure, tested by decades of humiliation, became her greatest. Still, danger never fully vanished. In post-war Hungary, where shifting regimes rose and fell, aristocrats were often targets of resentment. Rumors circulated that her estate might be seized, that her husband's rank, granted by the former emperor, could be revoked. Stéphanie handled such threats with quiet persistence. She cultivated relationships with local officials, supported community projects, and kept the estate open to neighbors. Her generosity created a buffer of goodwill. When she could not fight power directly, she disarmed it with decency. It was a lesson she had learned long before, in Vienna. When you cannot command, you must persuade. When you cannot win loyalty, you must earn respect. Even in peace, her survival demanded vigilance. She knew that her life would always be shadowed by the past. The Marling tragedy, Rudolf's death, the loss of titles, the family rifts, these remained subjects of fascination and rumor. Biographers, journalists, and distant relatives tried to pry into her secrets. She learned to control information with precision. Her letters became models of restraint, warm yet cautious, revealing emotion only in careful measure. She understood that in her world, a misplaced word could become a weapon. Over time, secrecy itself became a kind of identity. She was no longer merely the widow of a prince or the wife of a count. She was a woman defined by what the world could not quite know. Visitors to her estate described her as gracious but guarded, elegant yet remote. She rarely spoke of Vienna, and when she did, her tone was detached, almost scholarly. It was not bitterness but fatigue, a decision to let memory remain undisturbed. Yet those who spent time with her sensed the undercurrent of sorrow. The effort of maintaining composure, year after year, had worn her spirit thin. Her memoirs, published late in life, reveal how deeply she had internalized secrecy. In them she wrote with care, exposing pain without surrendering dignity. She described her marriage to Rudolf with compassion and honesty, admitting mistakes but avoiding sensationalism. The most striking passages are those in which she reflects on isolation, the loneliness of palace life, the cruelty of gossip, the price of duty. She wrote not as a victim, but as a witness. Yet even in confession, she withheld as much as she revealed. It is clear she wanted control over how history would remember her. After decades of being spoken about, she wished at last to speak for herself. The act of writing these memoirs was itself dangerous. By revisiting the Marling tragedy, she risked reopening wounds within the Habsburg family and provoking public debate. Yet she proceeded, carefully negotiating publication through trusted intermediaries. The book was edited and censored, but its appearance still stirred attention. Readers were struck by her intelligence, her restraint, and her lack of bitterness. For the first time, the public glimpsed the woman behind the myth. The process of publishing, though, came at emotional cost. Reliving those memories required her to reopen a lifetime of pain she had spent years suppressing. Through these struggles, Stéphanie's faith played a quiet role. She was not ostentatiously religious, but her letters show a steady belief in divine justice and the moral order of life. Faith gave her a structure when worldly certainties collapsed. She attended Mass regularly, supported local churches, and maintained correspondence with clergy who respected her intellect. It was through faith that she reconciled with loss. Yet even here secrecy persisted. Her spiritual life was private, seldom discussed. She believed that the purity of devotion lay in silence, not display. As she aged, her health began to decline, but her mind remained sharp. Visitors described her as precise in speech, capable of quoting literature and history with ease. The composure that had once been armor became serenity. Yet the cost of such lifelong vigilance showed in the distance she kept from others. She had few intimate friends, perhaps because intimacy required vulnerability, a risk she had long ago learned not to take. Her household was loyal but formal. Even those who served her for decades rarely saw her without the veil of dignity she maintained. There were still betrayals, even in later years. Some who had benefited from her kindness sought advantage in her name. Relatives disputed inheritance, biographers twisted her words, and the press returned to old scandals. She faced these renewed assaults with the same steadiness she had mastered in youth. By then, experience had taught her that reputation is less fragile when it no longer defines identity. She no longer fought to defend her place in history. She simply lived out her days with the quiet assurance that truth needed no performance. Her final years were marked by both peace and solitude. The world that had once judged her had largely forgotten her. The empires she had known were gone, replaced by new borders and ideologies. Yet the estate at Rudolf's remained a small world of order amid chaos. There, surrounded by gardens she tended and the few possessions she had chosen to keep, she lived as she wished, not as a royal relic, but as a woman who had survived. When her husband died before her, she bore the loss with the same calm acceptance that had carried her through every trial. Looking back on her life, the personal cost of survival becomes clear. She had sacrificed comfort, belonging, and at times love itself for the sake of dignity. She had endured betrayal by family, condemnation by society, and erasure from the history she once embodied. Yet she never surrendered her sense of self. Her survival was not merely biological, it was moral. It was the triumph of character over circumstance. Her story, when stripped of titles and tragedy, reveals a human struggle that resonates beyond royalty. The fight to remain intact in a world that punishes vulnerability. The scandals that haunted her, the secrecy that protected her, the composure that became her shield, all were parts of a larger battle for autonomy. She did not live to see her reputation fully restored, but she left behind a legacy more enduring than fame. Those who study her life today recognize in her not just a figure of sorrow, but a symbol of endurance. Stéphanie's quiet defiance against a system that consumed those it claimed to honor speaks to the strength of her spirit. She survived not by escaping pain, but by mastering it, shaping it into wisdom. In her later letters, she wrote that a life without dignity is not worth the breath it takes. That sentence, simple and proud, could serve as her epitaph. She had lived through scandal and secrecy, betrayal and exile, yet she never lost her dignity. That was the true cost of her survival, and its reward. The years following Stéphanie's death offered little immediate recognition of her struggle. History, in its early retellings, continued to treat her as a peripheral figure, defined more by the tragedy of Marling and her proximity to Emperor Franz Joseph than by any independent meaning. For decades, she was remembered as the princess who had failed to keep her husband from self-destruction, or as the widow who had defied rank by marrying beneath her station. The silence surrounding her life after Vienna became part of the myth. Yet as time softened the political and moral judgments of her century, historians began to return to her story with new questions. Who was she beyond the court gossip and imperial record? What does her journey reveal about the unseen architecture of power that shaped the lives of royal women in the 19th and early 20th centuries? To reconsider Stéphanie is to confront how imperial history has been written. The grand narratives of empire usually center on emperors, generals, treaties, and wars. Women, even those born to crowns, often appear as ornaments or cautionary figures. In that world, influence was acknowledged only when it was public and male, while the subtle negotiations of women were treated as social or emotional rather than political. Stéphanie's life unsettles that framework. She moved within the same corridors as monarchs and ministers, yet her power, when she had it, existed in whispers, alliances, and perception. She was trained to be silent and decorative, yet she learned that silence could also conceal strategy. The reevaluation of her role began quietly in the mid-20th century, when scholars examining the Habsburg decline looked beyond military and diplomatic failures to the cultural weaknesses of the court. They found in Stéphanie's experience a mirror of the contradictions that weakened the dynasty. She was expected to embody domestic virtue while navigating a system that denied her autonomy. Her position as Rudolf's wife placed her at the intersection of conflicting ideals: obedience to tradition and the emerging liberal spirit of the age. When she failed to conform perfectly to either, the system discarded her. In that sense, her fall was not personal but structural. She became collateral damage of an empire unable to adapt to the modern world. Through her, historians have come to see how the monarchy's rigidity constrained not only its subjects but also its own members. Stéphanie's attempts to exercise compassion and reason after Rudolf's death were punished because they did not fit the imperial script of silent endurance. Her later remarriage, rather than being seen as a moral lapse, can now be read as an act of self-assertion against a power that demanded submission even in widowhood. This shift in interpretation reflects a broader movement in historical study, one that seeks to understand power as more than official authority. Stéphanie's quiet defiance, her management of her estate, her writing, and her refusal to disappear entirely all testify to a different kind of influence, one that operates beneath visibility but shapes perceptions nonetheless. Her story also exposes the double standards that governed women in royal life. A prince could indulge in scandal, pursue affairs, or voice political opinions without permanent damage to reputation. A princess, by contrast, was expected to represent purity and restraint, her worth measured by the stability she lent to her husband's image. When that image fractured, as it did at Marling, she bore the weight of public condemnation. Stéphanie's composure in the aftermath, her insistence on maintaining dignity while being silently blamed, demonstrates both the cruelty of those standards and her endurance within them. Her restraint, once seen as coldness, now appears as an act of survival. To look at Stéphanie anew is also to re-examine how history records emotion. Imperial archives preserve decrees, reports, and letters of state, but the human experiences behind them, grief, fear, humiliation, rarely appear. Stéphanie's private writings, scattered across libraries and collections, open a window into that hidden emotional world. They show a woman conscious of her role in a grand machinery, yet struggling to find meaning within it. Her reflections on duty and loss do not read as rebellion, but as recognition of the limits imposed upon her. In that recognition lies her modernity. She understood, long before historians did, that the structures of empire were built on the quiet sacrifice of individuals like her. Her life also challenges the idea that female influence in monarchies was limited to romantic intrigue or maternal advice. Stéphanie's interventions in charitable work, her management of estates, and her strategic alliances within the Hungarian nobility demonstrate practical intelligence. She learned that to survive in a patriarchal system, she had to translate personal loyalty into political protection. This understanding of relational power, how favor, reputation, and perception could be wielded like instruments, anticipated what later generations would call soft power. Her methods may have been subtle, but their endurance speaks for their effectiveness. Even as formal power slipped away, she remained relevant within her own circles, shaping opinion and earning respect through discipline and integrity. In the broader imperial narrative, Stéphanie serves as a lens through which to study the decline of dynastic culture itself. The late Habsburg period was a time of conflicting identities. National aspirations rose against imperial unity, while scientific progress and liberal thought challenged religious and monarchical authority. Stéphanie stood at the heart of these contradictions. Her Belgian upbringing, imbued with constitutional ideas, clashed with the autocratic traditions of Vienna. Her marriage symbolized alliance, but also revealed incompatibility between Old and New Europe. In her struggle to reconcile personal conscience with dynastic duty, she embodied the crisis of an era. The Marling tragedy, often treated as a private disaster, can be read as the moral collapse of a generation that could no longer sustain its illusions. By tracing Stéphanie's life through this lens, historians have begun to understand that empires do not fall solely through wars or revolutions, but through the erosion of belief in their own necessity. Women like her, once silent witnesses, become vital evidence of that erosion. Their private suffering marks the moment when the imperial ideal ceased to convince even those inside it. Stéphanie's gradual withdrawal from public life, her decision to build a modest existence in Hungary, and her later insistence on privacy all suggest a conscious turning away from the myths that had once defined her world. In leaving the stage, she quietly declared the performance over. Modern scholarship also recognizes the importance of her voice as a writer. Her memoirs, though constrained by decorum, are among the few first-hand accounts of imperial life written by a woman of her rank. They reveal not only personal emotion, but also the tone of an insider observing a system from within. Her perspective challenges the grandiloquent style of official histories, replacing it with measured realism. When she wrote of the gilded loneliness of court life, she offered more than sentiment. She provided social commentary. Her testimony has become a valuable source for understanding how power operated through etiquette, hierarchy, and unspoken rules. In contemporary analysis, Stéphanie's life encourages historians to question the definition of success and failure in royal narratives. If success is measured by lasting influence, then her survival, dignity, and authorship mark her as quietly triumphant. If failure means exclusion from power, then almost every woman of her rank was destined to fail. The very framework of judgment must change. Through her, one can see that endurance itself is a form of achievement. By living through scandal, by preserving self-respect when stripped of privilege, she demonstrated a moral resilience that contrasts sharply with the fragility of the empire that abandoned her. Beyond the study of monarchy, her story has broader implications for how societies remember women who defy expectation. Stéphanie was neither saint nor schemer. She was a complex individual negotiating impossible boundaries. To label her merely as tragic is to ignore her agency. To call her victorious would deny her suffering. The truth lies in the tension between the two. She lived in shadow, yet left a trace strong enough to reshape the light in which we view her time. Her endurance redefines what it meant to possess strength in a world that offered women no language for it. The re-examination of her life also aligns with a larger cultural movement that seeks to restore women to their rightful place in history, not as footnotes but as participants. Stéphanie's marginalization is not unique. It reflects a systemic pattern by which women's experiences were deemed secondary to the grand narrative of men's deeds. In recovering her voice, historians are also restoring balance. Her story forces readers to confront how easily archives, shaped by those in power, erase inconvenient lives. Every rediscovered letter, every corrected rumor, becomes an act of resistance against that erasure. Her enduring relevance lies not only in what she endured, but in what she represents for our understanding of agency. She shows that power is not always visible or loud. Sometimes it is the decision to endure humiliation without surrender, to rebuild a life without permission, to write one's truth after years of silence. Stéphanie's legacy invites us to rethink how we define influence. Her survival changed no laws and toppled no thrones, yet it revealed the limits of those very institutions. She stands as a reminder that history's true power often resides in those who outlast it rather than those who command it. In recent years, renewed interest in women of the Habsburg dynasty has led to exhibitions, biographies, and documentaries that place Stephanie alongside figures like Empress Elizabeth and Archduchess Marie Valerie. These projects highlight contrasts as much as parallels. Elizabeth's rebellion was romantic and visible. Stephanie's was practical and contained. Where the Empress sought escape through travel and mystique, Stephanie found endurance in work and order. The comparison underscores that resistance takes many forms. Some fight by breaking free, others fight by staying and surviving. Both reveal cracks in the system they inhabit. Re-evaluating Stephanie also means reassessing how empathy functions in historical interpretation. For a long time, her reserved demeanor made her difficult for writers to romanticize. Yet that very restraint speaks to the demands of her position. She could not afford the luxury of passion in a world that punished emotion. Today's historians, more attuned to psychological complexity, can read her silence not as coldness, but as coded communication, a way of asserting control in circumstances that allowed little of it. Her life demonstrates that composure, often dismissed as passivity, can be an act of rebellion. The study of her later years, when she lived quietly in Hungary, further broadens our understanding of post-imperial identity. Many former royals struggled to adjust to a world without titles or defined roles. Stephanie managed the transition with remarkable steadiness. She adapted to a life measured by work, faith, and companionship rather than ceremony. In doing so, she became one of the few members of her generation to find genuine peace. This adaptability, overlooked in earlier histories, now appears as evidence of character rather than resignation. Her life thus bridges two worlds, the rigid hierarchy of empire and the uncertain modernity that replaced it. What emerges from this reassessment is a more nuanced picture of imperial history itself. The grandeur of courts, the solemnity of rituals, and the rhetoric of divine rule all depended on the compliance of individuals like Stephanie. When that compliance faltered, the illusion weakened. By tracing her gradual detachment, we can see how the empire's moral authority unraveled from within. Her withdrawal from public life was not merely personal retreat. It was symbolic of a system losing its own believers. In that sense, her quiet life at Rosovsk becomes a metaphor for the twilight of dynastic Europe. As historians and readers, recognizing her significance demands more than sympathy. It requires a change in method. To understand figures like Stephanie, one must read between the lines of official records, interpret silences, and respect the emotional truths that formal documents conceal. Her story encourages a more human approach to history, one that values interior experience alongside political event. By doing so, we begin to see the past not as a series of decrees and dates, but as a web of lives shaped by constraint and choice. In reflecting on her legacy, it becomes clear that Stephanie's greatest contribution to historical understanding is not in what she did, but in what her experience reveals about power. She shows that power without compassion corrodes, that duty without freedom suffocates, and that dignity can survive even in defeat. Her life forces a reckoning with the assumptions that sustained imperial order. The belief that hierarchy ensured harmony, that gender defined capacity, that obedience guaranteed stability. Her endurance exposes the fragility of those beliefs. To look beyond surface-level history, one must see her not as an isolated case, but as part of a larger story about how women's lives illuminate the hidden workings of empire. Stephanie's quiet resistance, her careful navigation of danger, and her ultimate choice to write her own version of events stand as a call to readers and scholars alike, to question whose voices have been silenced and why. Every empire, no matter how grand, depends on forgetting. Remembering Stephanie is therefore an act of historical justice. Her name may never carry the glamour of Elizabeth or the legend of Rudolf, yet her significance lies in endurance rather than spectacle. She reminds us that history is not only made by those who rule, but also by those who survive the rulers. To study her is to understand that even in the most constrained lives, there exists a form of strength that transcends circumstance. Her shadowed legacy, once overlooked, now enriches the portrait of an age and challenges us to see beyond its illusions. The story of Stephanie, once told as a cautionary tale, now serves as a measure of historical progress. By acknowledging her as more than a supporting figure, we acknowledge the humanity of all those whose lives were reduced to roles within larger dramas. In doing so, we redefine what it means to be remembered. Her journey from imperial bride to independent widow, from public spectacle to private dignity, encapsulates the transformation of Europe itself, from rigid order to uncertain freedom. Her legacy endures not in monuments or dynastic continuities, but in the ongoing effort to tell her story truthfully. Each new generation of scholars who studies her, each reader who encounters her words, extends that legacy further. Through them, Stéphanie continues to challenge the narratives that once confined her. She stands as a quiet, yet enduring witness to the resilience of the human spirit within the history.